After the Soviet invasion of their homeland Georgia, the Mdivani family fled to Europe and America, where the 5 siblings styled themselves as princes and princesses and proceeded to con and marry their way through Hollywood and high society, until they had achieved such notoriety for their social climbing, they were nicknamed the Marrying Mdivanis. Among their conquests were some of the wealthiest heiresses in the world, glamorous stars and artists, the list goes on. I have already mentioned their story in my previous video on the wild lives and decades-long feud of the so-called richest girls in the world, Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton. The first of Barbara's 7 marriages was to the youngest Mdivani brother, Alexis. He had been married once before to heiress and a member of the Astor family, Louise Astor Van Allen. After Alexis divorced Louise to marry Barbara Hutton, Louise married Alexis's brother Sergei. Sergei had already been married twice before. Firstly to one of the biggest stars of the silent era, Paula Negri, and then to Mary McCormick, who numbered among the most famous opera singers in the world at the time. David Gigauri married another of the most famous actresses of the 1920s, Mae Murray, and had gone to truly insane lengths to win her over. Their marriage bankrupted Mae and destroyed her career. Their divorce, as well as the subsequent custody battle for their only son, made headlines. Not to be outdone, the Mdivani sisters also married well and caused their fair share of scandal. The eldest of the siblings, Nina, married firstly a highly successful lawyer whom she could rely on to act as her siblings' divorce attorney when needed, and then she married Dennis Conan Doyle, the son of Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle. After Dennis's death, Nina married his secretary. The youngest sister, Isabel Rusidana, known as Rusi, married only once, but made up for her comparative restraint by meddling in her siblings' romances and causing enough trouble in her own. She stole her only husband, renowned Spanish artist José María Sert, from his wife, concert pianist, socialite, and artistic muse Mzia Sert. Such was Rusi's Mdivani charm, Mzia ended up planning their wedding. From rural Eastern Europe to Paris, the Riviera, and Hollywood at its most glamorous, today we will follow the rise and fall of the most scandalous family to take high society by storm. General Zachary Mdivani, the father of the notorious siblings, once joked he was the only father in history to inherit a noble title from his children. When people telephoned asking for Prince Mdivani, the general would say, "You must mean one of my sons." Born to an aristocratic family in the subtropical city of Batumi on the Black Sea coast of Georgia, Zachary graduated military school in the country's capital Tbilisi, then served in the Georgian army and was eventually appointed aide-de-camp to Tsar Nicholas II. Most likely in 1899 or early 1900, Zachary, then in his 30s, married the teenage Elizabeth Sobolewska. Elizabeth's mother was Georgian and her father was a Polish man who had been exiled to Georgia after an uprising, most likely the January Uprising of 1863. In 1901, Elizabeth and Zachary welcomed their first child, Nina, followed by Sergei in 1903, David in 1904, Isabel Rusidana, known as Rusi, in 1905, and finally Alexis in 1908. One should note that the siblings' exact dates of birth and even their birth years have been subject to debate, and later in life were often a source of difficulty for the siblings themselves, when it came to securing passports and other official documentation. Thanks to their father's work, the children rarely spent long in one place. The family divided most of their time between living in Tbilisi with Zachary's parents and in St. Petersburg, where the charming and socially ambitious Elizabeth soon became part of Grigory Rasputin's circle of female friends. It was through this friendship, as well as Zachary's work with the Tsar, that the Mdivanis became closely acquainted with the imperial family, even dining on the royal yacht at the Tsar's table during the celebrations of 300 years of Romanov rule in 1913. Nina Mdivani remembered her parents' time at the imperial court fondly, recalling the beauty and obvious wealth of her mother's friends, a sharp contrast to the life that was only a few short years ahead of them. Following the outbreak of World War I, Elizabeth volunteered for the war effort in St. Petersburg, before the Tsar made Zachary governor of Batumi. The general moved his family to the dilapidated but sprawling family castle there, which was ruled by Zachary's cantankerous father Aslan. Aslan had lost a leg fighting in the Turkish-Caucasian War, and firmly believed in Georgia's independence from Russia. For that reason, he never forgave his son for loyally serving the enemy. Aslan was the lord of numerous villages and owned miles of land which contained lucrative gold mines. He was considered a member of the aristocracy, but the Mdivanis' strongest claim to royalty came from Zachary's mother Maria, who belonged to a family whose noble lineage dated back centuries. At the time, Batumi was becoming the centre of the Russian Empire's oil industry, and much of Zachary's wealth derived from his shares in oil companies. With Zachary often absent and Elizabeth occupied with her social life, it was eldest daughter Nina who became a second mother to her younger siblings. She doted on the babies of the family, Rusi and Alexis especially, but failed to control Sergei and David, who soon developed a notorious reputation among the locals. The residents of Batumi locked their doors when they saw the brothers approach, for fear of being terrorized with mischievous antics. Even as teenagers, Sergei and David were known for their womanizing and liked nothing better than playing pranks. On one occasion, they stole their grandfather's wooden leg and burned it. Another time, David painted the family's pet donkey red. Sergei stowed away on a train carrying soldiers to see where they were going, but was sent back when they learned his identity. The brothers embarrassed their father by charging a small fee to carry luggage at the Batumi train station. They wanted to earn money to buy treats for their two beloved horses, but were soon recognized as the governor's sons, and Zachary got rid of the horses as a punishment. The final straw came when Sergei used his father's private train to show a family friend around the city during a time of unrest after the revolution. When questioned about his father's whereabouts, Sergei made the excuse that Zachary was ill. In a time when children were to be seen and not heard, and perfect obedience was expected, Sergei's blatant disrespect for authority and his lack of responsibility enraged Zachary. The general had been appointed Minister of War by the new government after George declared independence from Russia in 1918. While much of the country was engulfed in revolutionary unrest, Batumi remained relatively peaceful and had the support of British forces. Zachary knew this calm would not last, however, and with an important role to carry out, he had no time to discipline his wayward sons. It was decided that Sergei and David should be sent abroad for education, and fortunately, the perfect opportunity arose. The friend who Sergei had taken sightseeing was an American millionaire called Zenas Marshall Crane. He was the son of a senator and a member of the family that had created the Crane Currency Company, which among other things supplied banks with notepaper. Crane was officially in Batumi as part of the charitable Near East Relief Commission, which raised funds and provided aid to Armenian refugees. His charity work also provided him with the perfect opportunity to investigate the city's growing oil industry, and it is likely in this capacity that he became acquainted with Zachary. Crane was a regular visitor to the Mdivani household, and brought the children gifts. He took a liking to Sergei and David especially, but Rusi, with her wild imagination, believed Crane was a spy, and even interrogated him on the matter. Sergei and David's own imaginations had been fed by the many stories of the Wild West they had heard from their French tutor, who had lived there himself, and now the boys were obsessed with the thought of going to America. It was a great relief to both their neighbours and no doubt their parents when Crane departed for Constantinople, taking the brothers with him. They stayed at the Para Palace Hotel and attended a ball at the American Embassy among other amusements, before moving on to Italy and London. The boys marvelled at every sight they saw, but were impressed most of all upon arriving in New York. They sailed past the Statue of Liberty and gazed in awe at Manhattan's skyscrapers. Sergei recalled how it seemed that one could step off their tops right onto the streets of heaven. After a few weeks of staying at Crane's home in Massachusetts, the brothers were sent to one of the most prestigious boarding schools in the country, Phillips Academy, just outside of Boston. Although they spoke no English upon arriving in America, the brothers must have learned quickly, as they soon became popular at the school and were nicknamed the Princes. As competitive as they were close, Sergei and David frequently fought, even to the point of duelling with swords, which, inexplicably, they were allowed to keep at school. Eventually the brothers were put in separate dorms, and after a year their wild behaviour got them expelled. During the holidays they worked long hours at Crane's farm or his mill, and gained valuable work experience. Ultimately they dreamed of making their fortune in oil, just as their father had. The brothers left Georgia just in time. In 1921 the Red Army invaded, and as members of the nobility and ruling class, Elizabeth and her remaining 3 children had no choice but to flee. They were forced to outrun a mob on their way to the boat that would take them to Constantinople. Only when they had set sail did Elizabeth realise that in the panic she had left behind the luggage filled with jewels and silver and instead took a trunk containing useless items. In Constantinople, Elizabeth and Nina spent their days traipsing from embassy to embassy in search of a way to get to Paris. Elizabeth comforted herself by reading, playing cards, eating Turkish delight, and going to the cinema when she could afford it. She still played hostess when she could, in an effort to make connections, and clung on to the hope that the family's problems would be solved when Gigauri arrived and sold his oil shares. Russi and Alexis, meanwhile, attended an American school, but spent much of their time exploring the exotic city. The children adored Constantinople's bustling port, and made friends with the sailors who shared their lunch with the charming pair. Soon the siblings had a profitable business shining shoes, and no doubt pleased their mother when they were paid in movie tickets to put up posters. When Gigauri finally joined his family, they discovered just how difficult it is to sell shares to oil companies that reside in a war zone. While Elizabeth and the children moved on to Paris, Gigauri remained in Constantinople, still hoping to sell the shares and becoming increasingly embittered at the way the wealthier Georgian émigrés were able to enjoy the city. To save money on the long train journey to Paris, Alexis posed as the family's servant and travelled in third class, taking what small jobs he could to raise the family's dwindling funds. Once in Paris, they rented a small flat on the Rue de Montparnasse. Elizabeth immediately threw herself into helping the Georgian émigré community, while Nina and Russi took to the social scene with ease. Despite their poverty, the two sisters dressed with bohemian elegance, and soon became renowned for their beauty and charm. Their titles granted them an entree into café society, where they mixed with popular artists, actors, politicians, and aristocracy. It didn't matter to high society that they were penniless. After all, the sisters were simply part of a growing number of nobility to flee the former Russian Empire and settle in Paris. During the 1920s and 30s, if you hopped into a taxi in Paris, you might find one of the last Tsar's nephews driving it. Another nephew was the manager of Chanel's Biarritz shop, while yet more Russian aristocrats modelled for her. Parisian high society was fascinated by these émigrés, and even a dubious title could go a long way socially. Nina soon became part of banker Baron Maurice de Rothschild's social circle, while Russi befriended J.P. Morgan's grandson. In May of 1922, the entire Mdivani family were reunited at last when Sergei and David, accompanied by Crane, came to Paris, and Gigauri arrived shortly after. To celebrate, a party was thrown in the Mdivani's apartment. In the early hours of the morning, Elizabeth lay down exhausted and died shortly afterwards. Her passing formally marked the end of an era for the distraught family. With no hope of returning to their homeland, the siblings were forced to make the best of things wherever they could, and although their emotional closeness remained as strong as ever, they drifted apart from each other geographically and would never rebuild the home they had known as children. General Gigauri adored his wife and never remarried. Elizabeth's unexpected passing affected the youngest daughter Russi the most. By this point, she had discovered she possessed a talent for sculpting and scraped together a small studio where she retreated to work through her grief with art. She trained under famous sculptor Noam Aronson and quickly achieved not only recognition but a steady income from her work. She sculpted many famous and important people in Paris, such as actress Kay Francis, who ended up having an affair with Alexis. Some of Russi's sculptures were exhibited in the spring 1923 salon of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, one of the most prestigious art shows in the country. Russi learned that very near to the Mdivani's apartment, a famous artist, José Maria Sert, had his own studio. One day, Russi knocked on Sert's door and announced, "I am Princess Mdivani." From that moment on, the considerably older artist was charmed by the mysterious and attractive Russi. While she was only 20, José was around 50. His wife Mizia was an accomplished concert pianist and patron of artists, who played muse to the likes of Renoir and Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. She was also the godmother to Picasso's first son. Nicknamed the Queen of Paris, her approval would instantly elevate an artist's career. Likewise, her disapproval could spell the end of it. She had certainly been instrumental in her husband's success, and it is possible that Russi only approached José in order to meet Mizia. Mizia knew many women visited her husband's studio, and she claimed she had never been jealous or even suspicious until she heard the way he spoke about Russi. Mizia was determined to meet the mysterious princess and befriend her in order to prevent an affair. José had been giving Russi lessons in art, and they may have already been lovers by the time Mizia met her. There are different accounts of when and how the two women first met. In one version, Mizia came to Russi's studio when she was sculpting a bust of famous Japanese actor Sesuo Hayakawa, who I mentioned in my video on Japan's first international star, Sadayako. In another story, Mzia went out to lunch with Rusi and Nina and was touched by Rusi's polite refusals of every social invitation Mzia offered her. Rusi explained she was still too grief-stricken over her mother's death to consider attending social events. Mzia felt there was no need to feel threatened by a sweet, impoverished girl. Soon the two were firm friends. Rusi became a regular visitor to the Sirts' home, bringing the usual Mdivani chaos into their lives. She owned an unruly pet monkey, recited poems in made-up languages, and enthralled her new friends with stories about her family's journey to Paris. Mzia had not known her own mother and had no children. In her memoirs, she said she viewed Rusi almost as a daughter, at least at the beginning of their relationship. Mzia was certainly aware early on that Rusi was Jose's mistress, and yet that did nothing to diminish Mzia's love for them both. As a wife, she was beginning to feel pangs of jealousy, but as Rusi's friend and mother figure, Mzia wanted to protect her young protégé from heartbreak over a considerably older man. The other Mdivani siblings initially disapproved of their sister's relationship with the Sirts. It seemed all of Paris was gossiping about the strange situation of an attractive young girl practically living with an eccentric couple old enough to be her parents. It was generally assumed the trio had become a ménage à trois, and while that is certainly possible, Mzia and Rusi's relationship was just as likely to have been platonic. Nina Mdivani's love life was somewhat more straightforward. She had always been a romantic, although a far more practical soul than her siblings. She met her first husband, lawyer Charles Henry Hubrick, through her father, who consulted Hubrick about the sale of the oil shares. 26 years Nina's senior, Hubrick had been married once before and had a daughter who was only 2 years younger than Nina. He had been a professor at Stanford University, and although he specialized in international law, he attracted wealthy clients with his skill as a divorce lawyer and operated offices in multiple countries. Perhaps it was a shared passion for international law that attracted Hubrick to Nina, as she had finished a postgraduate course on international law and diplomacy at the School of Political Science in Paris. Nina had also written short stories based on Georgian folklore, which were published in numerous magazines. Hubrick and Nina married at a registry office in Oxford, England, in July of 1925, with Alexis as a witness, before having a church wedding in Paris that October with Rusi as maid of honour. By this time, Rusi was not only inundated with commissions for sculptures, but was increasingly depressed by her intense relationship with the Sirts. Nina encouraged her to join their brothers in America and further her career, and Rusi announced her intention to depart for New York at Nina's wedding reception. When the Sirts saw Rusi off, Mzia felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Overcome with emotion, she gave the shivering Rusi her fur coat just as she was about to leave. In America, Rusi sculpted busts of President Coolidge, members of the Crane family and other high society figures, as well as Charlie Chaplin. Dividing her time between New York and Palm Beach, Rusi remained in America for almost a year, during which she became popular in high society, even being the guest of honor at a few of the many events she attended. Although Rusi attracted suitors in America, she remained unable to move on from Jose Sirt. He wrote to her that he would die if he could not be with her, and Rusi decided to return to Paris. After their mother's death, Sergei and David returned to America to pursue making their fortunes in the oil business. They had absolutely no idea how the industry worked, and were refused employment everywhere they went. Finally, the brothers found work at an electrical company in New York, but were fired after 3 months for having no skills in that industry either. They set a personal record for themselves at their next job as carpenters, when they were fired after only 4 days, when their boss realized they had never done a day of carpentry in their lives. Finally, David found a position as a photographer's assistant, and Sergei experienced some success as a real estate agent, but the promise of becoming self-made oil tycoons lured them away from New York before long. Realizing their inexperience, they sought the help of their benefactor Marshall Crane, who introduced them to the vice president of the Sinclair Oil Company. Sergei declared to the man that the brothers were happy to start from the bottom in the oil business, to which the vice president replied, "Do you know what the bottom is?" Sergei amusingly responded, "Not exactly, but we're willing to start there anyway." Ironically, many years later, David would marry Virginia Sinclair, the adopted daughter of the company's founder. But for now, the two brothers set off for Oklahoma, where they secured jobs in different companies and discovered what it truly meant to start from the bottom. For 2 years, Sergei and David laboured under the hot sun, in the freezing cold and the pouring rain, doing grueling manual labour 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for $6 a day. They dug ditches, laid pipes, and cleaned machinery until their father called them back to Paris, and when they returned to America, their romantic visions of becoming oil millionaires overnight were put on hold. After various failed business ventures, David decided to try his luck in California, while Sergei remained in New York. Meanwhile, Russie had returned to Paris with a terrible cold, and Mziya took her to Switzerland to recover. It was there Russie bluntly informed Mziya that Jose no longer loved her, and that the lovers were planning to marry. Mziya had been with Jose for over 20 years, and was still in disbelief he would leave her. When Russie returned to Paris and fell ill again, Mziya took her to a doctor who performed a minor operation, which further endangered her fragile health. When she became seriously ill, the Mdivanis accused Mziya of trying to harm Russie, and the two sides fought bitterly. Mziya promised herself that if Russie lived, she would divorce her husband and allow him and Russie to marry. When Russie recovered, she practically moved in with the Surts. They bought her first car and begged her not to drive so recklessly when they observed her and Alexis driving their cars side by side and holding hands as they raced around the Place de la Concorde. Many dark rumours swept through Paris about the trio. It was now public knowledge that Russie was having an affair with Jose, and the age gap as well as the fact the Surts had introduced Russie to narcotics looked terrible. The three were the inspiration for multiple plays, one of which Mziya stormed out of. The Mdivanis increasingly approved of the situation now that it seemed Jose was serious about divorcing his wife. After all, Jose was one of the highest paid painters in the world, largely thanks to Mziya's promotion of his career. Mziya was miserable and somewhat in denial about the breakdown of her marriage. Jose was ironically a devout Catholic, and applied for an annulment while also taking Charles Hubrick's advice to obtain a civil divorce and marry Russie in a Protestant country. Mziya was convinced that as long as the annulment was not granted and the couple were only married in a civil ceremony, she would remain Jose's real wife, and he would return to her once he tired of Russie. With Hubrick acting as Jose's lawyer, a divorce was granted in The Hague, after which Nina and Hubrick threw a dinner party to celebrate, and invited Mziya. Predictably, she broke into tears halfway through the strange ordeal, and Russie tried to comfort her by saying that both she and Jose still loved Mziya. Once back in Paris, Mziya fell ill from misery and went to stay with her close friend Coco Chanel, who barred all Russie's visits. Mziya still loved Russie and ordered Chanel to make up for her rude behaviour by designing Russie's wedding trousseau for less than Chanel's usual price. In the end, Russie and Chanel became good friends, as it seemed nobody was immune to the princess's considerable charm. Mziya distracted herself from the pain of her former husband marrying her friend by planning their wedding. Mziya went to all Russie's fittings, and she helped Jose choose a necklace for the bride, as well as the engagement ring. It was only when Mziya eagerly accompanied the newlyweds on their honeymoon that she realised she had become an irritating third wheel. Although she was still a part of their lives, the atmosphere between the trio had changed, and Mziya was increasingly excluded from the couple's vibrant social life. When one of Mziya's closest friends, ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev, died, she was distraught. Her grief worsened when both Russie and Jose ignored her telegrams. They were too busy establishing a glittering social life for themselves in Spain to comfort Mziya. Russie had taken over her predecessor's role in every way. Freed from poverty, the princess transformed herself into an elegant society hostess, and it was her connections, not Mziya's, that now furthered Jose's career. Russie was described as dressing like a hippie before hippies were invented, but a friend admitted her style was still a Chanel version of bohemian. The Surts bought an old castle in Spain called Mashuni and spared no expense in refurbishing it. Every summer they hosted guests for weeks of endless hedonistic parties that became notorious in the area. The guest list included actress Marlene Dietrich, director Luchino Visconti, writer and director Jean Cocteau, and Coco Chanel, among many others. Salvador Dali was the Surts' neighbour at Mashuni, and he described Russie as one of the most interesting women he had ever met. Mziya's sole comfort was that she and Jose had been married by the Catholic Church, while his marriage to Russie remained a civil one. Mziya was shocked to learn that Russie had been secretly converting to Catholicism, and after the annulment was granted, the marriage was blessed by the Church. Once in Los Angeles, it did not take long for David to begin his ascent up the ranks of Hollywood. Through the immigrant community, David soon became acquainted with one of the richest and most successful actresses in Hollywood, Pola Negri, who, like him, was an Eastern European immigrant with a talent for making the best of things. Born in rural Poland in 1897, Pola had risen from humble origins as the only surviving child of poverty-stricken parents to become the queen of tragic cinema during the silent era. In her early teens, Pola trained to be a dancer and achieved moderate success before falling ill with tuberculosis. After her recovery, she gradually rose to prominence in Polish theatre throughout the 1910s. Pola made her film debut in 1914, after which she became a prolific actress in the Warsaw film industry. Eventually, she moved to Germany, where she met director Ernst Lubitsch, and they made multiple internationally successful films together. When Pola arrived in Hollywood in 1922, she became the first European star imported to the film colony. Her first contract with Paramount paid her $3,000 a week. By the end of the 1920s, she had reportedly made $5 million. Pola married a Polish count in 1919 and divorced him in 1922. While in Germany, she began a highly publicized relationship with Charlie Chaplin, and there were even rumors the two would marry, but nothing came of it. By the time Pola met the Mdivanis in 1926, she was dating Rudolph Valentino, the most popular actor and greatest sex symbol of the 1920s, whose life I covered extensively in my video on his wife Natasha Rambova. Pola met David Gigauri through her mother Eleonora, who did not speak English and was grateful to find a charming bridge partner in the Russian-speaking David. Eleonora went out for drives with him in Pola's cars, and David soon became a regular visitor to the actress's home. In Hollywood, a world built on glamorous fiction, a fake prince with a never-ending supply of improbable-sounding stories fit right in, and was well on the way to becoming the first Mdivani to truly marry well. Pola was probably the wealthiest woman in Hollywood, but was practically engaged to Valentino, so David set his sights on another rich and famous actress. Almost 20 years his senior, Mae Murray was born into an impoverished family in New York in 1885. She began a dancing career as a chorus girl on Broadway in the mid-1900s, and was headlining the Ziegfeld Follies by the mid-1910s. She had known Valentino from his days as a dancer in New York, and was also a close friend of Pola's. Making her film debut in 1916, Mae was not as critically acclaimed as Pola, but by the time David met her in 1926, she was one of the best-paid actresses in Hollywood and still riding high from the greatest success of her career, starring in The Merry Widow in 1925. The film was both a critical and commercial success, solidifying Mae as not only a sex symbol, but silent cinema royalty. David already had his sights set on her by the time they met at one of Pola's star-studded parties. David followed Mae into an empty room where she had fallen asleep on a sofa, and awoke her with a kiss. When Mae jumped up in horror, David explained that was how things were done in his country. Before she could respond, Valentino arrived and formally introduced David. At 2 a.m. the very same night, Mae was in bed at her home when she was informed Prince Mdivani wanted to speak to her. She refused to see him, but the next morning as she was leaving her house, David suddenly appeared and dropped to his knees while kissing Mae's hand and proclaiming his love for her. Mae was irritated and amused in equal measure, but again refused him. He called her 7 times a day for multiple days in a row, and when Mae threw a party at her house, David arrived uninvited and snuck up to her bedroom. When the party was over and she was getting ready for bed, David jumped out of her closet and, despite being initially furious, she allowed him to stay and they ate dinner together. That night, David mentioned that he was interested in acting and asked if Mae could arrange a screen test. She obliged, but the Mdivani charm did not translate to the screen. Mae continued to firmly but politely turn David's affections down, and believed she might be rid of him, until her butler awoke her one night to tell her David had slashed his wrists in front of her house and had to be dragged unconscious into her hallway. Mae bandaged the cuts and called a doctor, praying that the story wouldn't make its way to the papers. She paid David's medical bills and told him to never come to her house again. Despite instructing her staff to ignore his calls and visits, her butler allowed him to come in one night, probably to avoid another incident, and David convinced Mae to come for a drive with him. He told her stories about his childhood, homeland, and family. Instead of dramatically declaring his love, David calmly talked about his interest in cars and the oil business. Just as Mae was beginning to enjoy his company, they pulled up to a cabin in the Hollywood Hills, and David insisted on carrying Mae inside. She was furious and refused to speak to him for 2 days. Unable to escape the cabin, Mae wondered if her butler and the studio had reported her missing yet. On the 3rd day, David implored Mae to speak to him, and when she remained silent, he went outside and began hysterically sobbing. May was overcome with pity and spoke to him. David passionately embraced her, and May was finally won over. She reasoned that there was something flattering about a man risking imprisonment for kidnapping the woman he loves. Her logic was perfectly in keeping with the improbable melodrama that was her career on screen. According to May, she and David were married only days later, having enlisted Rudolph Valentino to hastily plan the wedding. This slightly hysterical version of events was the one told by May, and as all the events from their courtship after the night they met were between David and May alone, it's hard to know how much of the story she embellished. David would prove to be a controlling and intense man throughout their marriage. His extreme behaviour could well be true, although as we shall see, May's assertion of only knowing David for a few weeks before their wedding must have been a lie. May likely wasn't as passive and helpless as she portrayed herself either. Paula Negri remembered David worrying that the age gap between him and May was too large. He was in his early 20s and she was 41. May was also fiercely competitive with other leading actresses and knew she would outrank them all as a princess. Paula had been a countess through her first marriage, then her rival Gloria Swanson married a marquis. May became Princess Mdivani on the 27th of June 1926, with Paula Negri as her maid of honour and Valentino as David's best man. May had dabbled in various denominations, but had recently embraced Catholicism. David was baptised a Catholic so they could be married in a Catholic church, and May declared that despite her previous 3 marriages, she was really marrying for the first time, as none of her other weddings had been in a church. The couple postponed going on honeymoon and instead immediately returned to work. Soon after the wedding, David secured his one and only film role in a comedy called A Princess in Town, where he played a movie star and was credited as David Manor. Meanwhile, the baby of the family, Alexis, had remained largely free from the drama of his siblings' lives. Through her marriage, Nina had enough money to send Alexis, who she believed was the most intelligent of the siblings, to a prestigious boarding school in England. He soon became friends with another student, William Van Allen, an American whose extremely wealthy family were connected by birth and marriage to the Vanderbilts and Astors. Alexis was practically adopted by the Van Allens. Instead of returning to his family, Alexis spent most of his summers and Christmases with the Van Allens in New York or at Wakehurst, their impressive second home in Newport. Alexis got to know the highest echelon of American society in Manhattan and Newport. He played polo with Vanderbilts and danced with heiresses. When William Van Allen went to Cambridge University, it was decided Alexis should go too, and the Van Allen family helped finance his education. He lived at Cambridge while he prepared for the entrance exam and was allowed to join the polo team despite not yet being a student. He soon rose to be the team's captain while also playing saxophone in the Cambridge Orchestra. Alexis regularly returned to Paris and stayed with Russi, and it was around this time he became acquainted with Dutch Javanese model Toto Koopman. Toto would remain a close friend of Nina's throughout her life and was enthralled by the glamour and chaos the Mdivanis created around themselves. She accompanied the siblings on many nights out and alongside them became a fixture in cafe society. It didn't take long for Alexis and Toto to begin an intense open relationship that would endure throughout both of his marriages. Although barely into his 20s, Alexis had already gained a reputation for his affairs. It was rumoured that as a young teenager he had had a fling with the most popular entertainer in France, Miss Danguette. She was a singer and actress who at the time was the highest paid female performer in the world. Her legs alone were insured for 500,000 francs. Alexis then moved on to Kay Francis, a popular American actress who he probably met when Russi was making a sculpture of her. From the time she stayed with Sergei and David in New York, it was said that Russi facilitated her brothers' social climbing by introducing them to wealthy women with whom they could have affairs. In the eyes of many, Russi was some kind of mastermind, always lurking in the background of her brother's high-profile romances. The nature of her close relationship with Alexis was also speculated upon. On the 23rd of August 1926, Rudolph Valentino died following surgery for appendicitis. Paula Negri, who claimed to be his fiancée, was distraught and reportedly fainted over a dozen times at the funeral, as well as having a large flower arrangement spelling out her own name placed on his coffin. The public viewed her behaviour as a tasteless publicity stunt, despite Paula's assertions that Valentino was the love of her life. Only 9 months after Valentino's death, the news that Pola planned to marry Sergei Mdivani was received by the public with shock and more than a little scorn. After the demise of her great love, Pola retreated to her Santa Monica beach house, and it was there that she met Sergei when David brought him for a swim. Pola was immediately attracted to Sergei, and they began spending a lot of time together. Pola always maintained that during this time they were only friends, and Sergei simply provided comfort to her while she grieved. In her version of events, Pola made it clear to Sergei that their relationship was platonic, but when she decided to go to her chateau outside Paris for a few months, Sergei booked a passage on the same boat, and by the time they reached France they were in love. In all likelihood they had begun an affair soon after meeting, although to minimise the haste of their engagement, Sergei claimed he and Pola had known each other since childhood. Pola was overwhelmed when she met Zachary, Nina, Rusi and Alexis all at once, but there was one Mdivani who was not eagerly awaiting the nuptials. Through a gossip column, May Murray discovered she would no longer be the only Princess Mdivani in Hollywood, and attempted to have the columnist, Luella Parsons, fired. May wrote to the magazine and demanded they retract the engagement announcement, as it was false, but was told that would be impossible, as the wedding was the next day. David told the press he would not be attending his brother's wedding, despite being in Paris at the time. Pola and Sergei had retreated to her recently refurbished chateau, where they received numerous guests, such as Picasso, composer Maurice Ravel, and Russian ballerina Mathilde Kaczynska, who had been the mistress of the last Tsar. As Pola's salary was around $500,000 a year, Sergei was begrudgingly forced to sign a prenuptial agreement. Although he wouldn't be entitled to anything in a divorce, he knew he could still spend his wife's money while they were married, and the wedding went ahead on the 14th of May 1927. There had of course been plenty of drama in the weeks leading up to it. The couple got into a row after Sergei accused Pola of flirting with other men, and she briefly called off the wedding until Rusi smoothed things over. As Sergei was an Orthodox Christian and Pola was Catholic, the two had a civil ceremony, after which a huge celebration was thrown at the chateau. David refused to go, and José Sert was Sergei's best man. The couple departed for the first part of their honeymoon in Deauville, where Sergei spent his wedding night losing extortionate amounts of money in casinos. Pola was furious and refused to pay his debts, but the newlyweds made up by the time they embarked on a yacht cruise to the Channel Islands. On the boat back to America, Sergei once again accused Pola of flirting with other men, and when he demanded she obey him, she reminded him who had more money. Pola was faced with two unexpected problems when she returned to Hollywood. Firstly, she had not anticipated the level of animosity she would receive from the public because of her marriage. Not only were her numbers in the box office falling, but instead of fan mail, she received a deluge of furious letters from Valentino's fans, who believed she had betrayed his memory. Pola's second problem was Sergei. He had married one of Hollywood's biggest sex symbols, and yet when she appeared scantily clad on screen, or worse, had to act out a love scene, Sergei became intensely jealous. Pola had also expected Sergei to return to his work in the oil fields, but he felt manual labour was beneath him as the husband of a star. Pola was therefore forced to finance an investment company, where Sergei foolishly bought into every ill-advised scheme he was presented with. The press meanwhile had been digging into the Mdivani's origins, and Photoplay magazine went as far as to hire a genealogist to prove that the brothers were not in fact princes. It didn't help when other Georgian émigrés who remembered the family said they had never been considered royalty in Georgia. Pola Negri fought back by hiring her own genealogist, who explained the complexity of the Russian Empire's aristocratic hierarchy. As the empire swallowed up more of its neighbours who had their own system of rank, they usually adjusted the noble titles to the Russian ranks. This in itself was complicated, and for many émigrés the difference between calling yourself a count or prince ultimately came down to personal choice. A humble person might translate their title to count despite it not being exactly accurate to their standing in their homeland. Technically in Georgia one could only be a prince if you were related to the royal Bagration family, but the Mdivanis argued that an ancestor had been bestowed the title by the king, and the matter was settled in the press. Meanwhile, David and May were hiding an even bigger secret than the legitimacy of a title. Somehow, despite intense scrutiny from the press, the couple managed to hide the fact they had had a son for almost 2 years. Karan Mdivani would never be sure of his true birthday or even of his parentage. He might have been only May's son, or David's by another woman, or perhaps he was adopted. While David maintained Karan was born in Los Angeles in 1927, it is likely he was actually born in France very early in 1926. Although a birth certificate was never found for Karan, his baptismal certificate gave his birthday as the 5th of January 1926. In late 1926, without informing MGM Studios, David and May set sail for Europe on a belated honeymoon. When May met Zachary, the old man embraced her tightly and called her Lily, which Rusey explained had been his nickname for his wife Elizabeth. David had never mentioned it, but apparently May bore a striking resemblance to his mother, and Zachary always liked her for that reason. David and May spent excessively, and were followed by a barrage of furious telegrams from MGM Studios ordering May to return at once. When the couple finally came back to America at their own leisure, May and MGM parted ways. David wanted his wife to retire from films and focus on family life. Like Sergei, David loathed his wife wearing skimpy costumes in films, and couldn't stand her love scenes. It was not long before they were setting sail for Europe again. To overshadow the news of Pola and Sergei's engagement, May told the press she and David were going on a world tour. In fact, they were using the speculation as to whether they would attend the wedding to divert the press from the true purpose of their trip, bringing Karan back to America. After a few months in France, May and her son sailed back to New York alone, while David took another ship and claimed his wife would return a few weeks later. Travelling separately was a sign of impending divorce to the press, and to avoid more reporters, David sailed to Canada and drove back to California. Young Karan was mostly cared for by his father, while May dealt with court cases and toured with a successful vaudeville act. She had been forced to return to work after making the discovery that her fortune had been severely depleted since her marriage. She was forced to borrow $22,000 to finance a stage production of The Merry Widow, which was an instant hit. For $250 a week, May employed a popular Hollywood masseuse, Sylvia Ulbach, who accompanied May when the show toured. Everything was going well until David arrived in New York and immediately began arguing with May about money. He decided to travel with the tour, and during one argument, May stormed out into the freezing cold night. When she returned hours later, David tried to fire Sylvia, which further enraged May. In the end, the hotel manager suggested May find other accommodation and return in the morning. Her luggage, including her costumes, were left with David, and he initially refused to give them back. Later on the tour, David locked May in a bathroom and went on a tirade about her skimpy costumes. When he threatened her, she called for the police, and David grabbed her by her neck and had to be wrestled to the ground by police officers. After David returned to California, the press learned of Karan's existence and went into a frenzy. Father and son were forced to move to another house to escape the mass of reporters, but even with the phones disconnected and the blinds drawn at their new home, the press found them and staked out their front lawn. David gave a few irritated interviews in an attempt to calm the situation, and could not understand what all the fuss was about. He said of the press, "They say they want the lowdown on my baby. There is no lowdown on my lovely baby, I say. We have a baby just like most married folks. Is there anything strange about that, I ask?" Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, May's tour had broken all previous records, and she refused to comment on her son. Later, when questioned about the strict privacy she kept Karan in, May said she believed children grew up best alone. She wanted her family to be just for herself, even if that meant sacrificing her child's socialization. Like May, Pola Negri's finances were rapidly depleted by her marriage. Not only did Sergei refuse to budget, but when Pola's contract came up for renewal at Paramount, the studio wanted to significantly decrease her salary, as she was no longer the box office draw she had been. Sergei encouraged Pola not to sign the new contract and hold out for a better offer. Then she found herself pregnant. The couple were overjoyed. Pola had always wanted to be a mother, and Sergei insisted she give up her career to focus on family life. The couple moved to Pola's chateau, and Sergei took up polo, buying a string of expensive ponies. He had no talent for the sport, and when Alexis came to visit, he convinced Pola to give him one of the ponies. Pola still received offers from studios, and when one producer came knocking, Sergei threw the man out and threatened that the next studio envoy to bother his wife would be shot. He and Pola fought over what gender they wanted the baby to be. While Sergei hoped for a boy, Pola wanted a girl, and a compromise was reached only when they decorated separate nurseries, one in pink, one in blue. Despite the press spreading rumours they were going to divorce, the couple's marriage had never been better, but then tragedy struck. Accounts differ as to how Pola lost her baby, but in the autumn of 1928, she suffered a miscarriage that devastated both her and Sergei. He threw endless parties to distract himself, while Pola stayed in her room drinking. Her dwindling finances meant she had no choice but to return to work. While Sergei travelled back to America to deal with her business affairs, Pola remained in France to prepare for her screen comeback, despite her husband's disapproval. Pola's mother begged Sergei not to interfere with her career, but when he learned his wife would appear partially nude in her upcoming film, he made her leave the production. This was the last straw for Pola, who had to pay 1 million francs to break her contract. She wanted a separation from Sergei and decided to go to London, having received various offers from English film companies. While she mixed in high society and of course found new romance, Pola was unaware Sergei had already met her replacement. On the boat back to Europe, Sergei met Mary McCormick, a world-renowned opera singer 14 years his senior. She had been married twice before and had 2 daughters from her first marriage. Both Sergei and Mary claimed it was love at first sight, although on Sergei's part the $2 million Mary was worth might have helped. They had begun an affair by the time the boat reached France. When Pola found out, she was furious and immediately went to her lawyer, while Sergei called on his brother-in-law Charles Hubrick. In 1929, Pola filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment, but when they met in court, the judge gave them a chance to reconcile, and they both declared they were still in love with each other and called off the divorce. This reconciliation proved short-lived. Not only was it impossible for the couple to get on, but not long after they reunited, the stock market crashed, further decimating Pola's fortune. She was forced to sell her chateau, and Sergei returned to Mary McCormick, whose career was still flourishing. David had established the Pacific Oil Company and was drilling on land belonging to May Murray. Mary gave Sergei the $15,000 he needed to buy into it, and within a year he was named executive vice president. Days after his divorce from Pola in April of 1931, Sergei and Mary were married. A month later, Alexis married Louise Van Allen, the little sister of his close friends William and James Van Allen. As heiress to millions and part of the uppermost echelon of East Coast society, Louise was the best catch yet for the family. After graduating Cambridge in 1927, Alexis had worked as the secretary of the Georgian legation in Paris, and then at the Paris branch of the New York City Bank. When Louise made her society debut in 1930, Alexis attended her coming-out ball. Louise had had a crush on him since they first met, and had been determined to marry him ever since. The only problem was Alexis was in love with Louise's friend Sylvia de Rivas, the daughter of the Colombian ambassador to France. The two even planned to elope, but Sylvia's father threatened to disinherit her and hired a private detective to follow her. Eventually, Sylvia was married off to a member of the French aristocracy, and Alexis decided that if he could not marry for love, he would marry for money. To make things even more complicated, Barbara Hutton, a mutual friend of both Sylvia and Louise, had also fallen in love with Alexis. Heiress to the Woolworths empire her grandfather had built, Barbara was set to inherit one of the largest fortunes in America on her 21st birthday. Her life and feud with another of the wealthiest heiresses in America, Doris Duke, was the subject of my last video. Barbara's family disapproved of Alexis and tried to keep her away from him as much as possible. The Van Allens proved an easier family to marry into, but Alexis continued to spend time with Barbara after his marriage to Louise. The simple wedding was held at the Van Allens' Newport home, Wakehurst, in May of 1931. None of Alexis' siblings were in attendance, but the bride's diamond engagement ring had been paid for by Russi. None of the family particularly liked the drab Louise, and when Nina asked why Alexis married her, he bluntly answered that it was solely for money. Immediately after the wedding, Louise bought Alexis an extensive custom-made wardrobe, a Rolls-Royce and 6 polo ponies. During their honeymoon in Biarritz, he was seen with Barbara Hutton more than with Louise, and rumours swirled about the two. In Paris, the newlyweds spent vast sums on refurbishing their apartment and throwing legendary parties. Barbara was often in attendance and was shamelessly familiar with Alexis. Louise desperately financed her husband's every whim in an effort to buy his love, but to no avail. Things came to a head when Russi invited Barbara to Massouni, where Alexis and Louise were also staying. Louise told Barbara she had an unfashionably large chest, to which Barbara scathingly replied better big than concave. Barbara considered leaving early, but Russi convinced her to stay, and not long afterwards, she and Alexis were caught in bed together by almost the entire party of guests. Louise was heartbroken, and Barbara believed Russi had orchestrated the whole incident. While Barbara fled to Paris hoping to avoid public scandal, Charles Hubrick was called to help the divorce proceedings between Alexis and Louise go smoothly. They were divorced after only 18 months of marriage, and Alexis immediately returned to pursuing Barbara Hutton with the encouragement of Russi. Out of sentimentality, Louise refused to close the joint account she shared with Alexis, and he used his ex-wife's money to finance a trip to New York to see Barbara. Barbara lived for the thrill of the forbidden, and now there were no obstacles between her and Alexis. She was cold towards him, and her family succeeded in keeping the two apart until he left New York. Fearing Alexis had lost an heiress for nothing, Russi manipulated Louise into blackmailing Barbara Hutton. Louise threatened that if Barbara did not marry Alexis, the Mashouni affair would be leaked to the press. Barbara decided to clear her head by going on a cruise around the world, with the final destination being Bali. Undeterred, Alexis caught up with her in Java, having used Russi's money to get there, and proposed as soon as he saw Barbara in the hotel lobby. Without her family to influence her, Barbara ecstatically accepted, and the couple planned to marry as soon as possible. As Barbara was still underage, she needed her father, Frank Hutton's, consent, and while he was on holiday, he received a call from the American consul in Bangkok asking his permission for Barbara to be married. Frank believed Alexis was a fortune hunter and had been confident he was out of Barbara's life for good. Needless to say, Frank was enraged and demanded to speak to Barbara, but got Alexis instead. Alexis told Frank he would marry Barbara with or without her father's consent, but they would agree to wait if Frank publicly supported a longer engagement. Begrudgingly, Barbara's father agreed, hoping that she would break things off given time to think it through. Alexis wrote to Russi that he had won the prize, and told her to announce the engagement. The couple planned to marry in Paris, but according to French law at the time, if a girl is married under the age of 21, all her money immediately becomes the property of her husband. Frank Hutton made Alexis sign a prenuptial agreement, and he was represented by Charles Hubrick during the negotiations. Alexis would receive Barbara's $1 million dowry, as well as $250,000 a year as an allowance. He and Barbara had a civil marriage on the 20th of June 1933, and were married in an Orthodox Christian ceremony 2 days later. 800 guests packed into the church, while 8,000 onlookers stood outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bride. An entire suite at the Ritz was needed to store the wedding presents, and when the newlyweds departed for a honeymoon in Lake Como and Venice, they took 70 pieces of luggage with them. Barbara declared to the press, "It's going to be fun being a princess," but she would soon regret those words. On the wedding night, Alexis told Barbara she was too fat, which prompted her to go on a crash diet where she only drank 3 cups of black coffee a day for weeks on end. By the time the honeymoon was over, she had lost 40 pounds, and had developed an eating disorder that would plague her throughout her life. Barbara had never been particularly insecure about her body prior to Alexis's comments, but now her obsession with maintaining a slim figure would prove to be her downfall. Barbara now found herself in the same position as Louise, constantly spending extortionate amounts of money to keep her husband interested. She bought him twice the number of polo ponies Louise had, but soon complained Alexis was more interested in playing polo than spending time with her. Frank Hutton's wedding present to the couple was a motor yacht called the Ali Baba, an amalgamation of the couple's names, which Alexis loved to race down the canals of Venice. Barbara had also bought Alexis a new custom wardrobe and, as an engagement present, had given him a Rolls-Royce Phantom II Continental drophead coupe, one of only 3 ever commissioned. As Alexis loved planes, Barbara had the dashboard redesigned to look like an aeroplane cockpit. She also gave Sergei Mdivani a custom-built Duesenberg Roadster. Meanwhile, David and May's marriage was as strained as ever. May had halted her Merry Widow tour to deal with mounting court cases. She was suing a couple called the Donovans, whom she claimed had sold her a faulty house full of fake antiques, and at the same time her former masseuse Sylvia was suing her for unpaid wages. May was sued yet again by the man she had briefly hired to direct an independent film she was planning, but then backed out once the press published her plans. Despite her obvious lack of money, May purchased beachfront land in Santa Monica, where she began constructing an Eastern-style mansion that cost around $55,000 to build. When Mzia Cert visited, she thought the Chinese decor was horrible and said the house looked like a mosque. As soon as it was finished, the city of Los Angeles sued May and some of her neighbours for building their homes beyond the tideland limits. May won her case against the Donovans and went back on tour to great acclaim, but just as the tour finished, the Donovans had May arrested for breaking into their home. May was eventually found not guilty, but the stress from the endless legal battles was beginning to show. May was utterly exhausted when only a few months later the police began to seize her assets, as she was still in debt to the Donovans over the house. A policeman claimed that when he tried to seize May's Rolls-Royce, he had to fight a man wearing a fake moustache to get it. The man was identified as David Gigauri, who denied all allegations. In the winter of 1928, May returned to the stage in New York, but despite her success, she was miserable at having to spend Christmas away from her son. May was not eager to return to films, as they now came with the added pressure of sound. In 1929, she decided to remake one of her earlier hits, Peacock Alley. The idea of 45-year-old May remaking a film from 1922, when she had been at the height of her beauty, was doomed from the start. Her former boss, Louis B. Mayer, had vowed to have her blacklisted from Hollywood after she broke her contract with MGM, and now he tried to sabotage the production of Peacock Alley. Not only that, but David as usual had problems with the film, and May's diva behaviour did not endear her to her co-stars. When the film was released, it was almost universally panned by critics and wasn't a hit with fans. The downward trajectory of May's career continued as she attempted more talkies, and her marriage was crumbling. David's jealousy had turned to violence, and the couple were known to have physical fights in public. David did not think it was fitting for the wife of a prince to be an actress, let alone appear on the stage and screen in skimpy outfits. Starting in 1928, David had beaten May and even chased her with a pistol. Screaming fits and verbal abuse were a regular occurrence, but the last straw came in early 1931, when the couple got into an argument at the popular Embassy Club on Hollywood Boulevard. David threw May on the floor, knocking her unconscious. When she awoke an hour later, he told her to stop making a long face over nothing, you know you're not hurt. May filed for divorce on the grounds of abuse in August 1931, but withdrew her petition only days later and returned to David. A year later, May was considering divorce again, and claimed when she spoke to David, he informed her she would have nothing if she left him, as he had put her money in his name. May realised too late she had married a fortune hunter. By 1932, the Pacific Oil Company was making a decent profit, and the Mdivani brothers only had their wives to thank for it. May and Mary McCormick had sunk vast sums of their fortune into the company, as well as providing the land to drill and finding investors among their social circle. This still wasn't enough to pay off the brothers' significant debts, and in late 1932, Sergei was taken to court for owing $50,000. Pola seized the opportunity to sue Sergei for $80,000 she claimed he owed her, and he sued her back for $131,000 and insisted he had been the one paying the bills throughout their marriage. Meanwhile, by early 1933, May Murray was so deeply in debt she was forced to sell her beachfront mansion and all the antiques that furnished it, as well as her remaining Rolls-Royce and prized jewellery collection. Mary McCormick could no longer find regular work and was facing her own mounting debt. Worst of all, the investors in Pacific Oil were building a case against the Mdivani brothers, who had taken tens of thousands from the company and failed to pay the investors back. In early 1933, General Zachary died in Paris, and David hoped May would accompany him to the funeral. He claimed they could start a new life in Europe and all their marital problems would be over. When May refused to go with him, she found herself responsible for the large hotel bill and became determined to get a divorce. Mary McCormick also remained in America while Sergei went to the funeral and was enraged when she learned he had removed $17,000 from their joint bank account to finance the trip. To make matters worse, he had been spotted enjoying himself in New York clubs before leaving. In June 1933, May filed for divorce on account of her husband's rage and jealousy, while at the same time Mary filed for separation for her safety. Despite claiming she wanted a quiet divorce, May aired the couple's dirty laundry to the press. She told reporters how David would refuse to leave the house until she changed into clothes he thought were appropriate, and his jealousy over any compliments she received. Meanwhile, Sergei and David had remained in Paris for Alexis's wedding to Barbara Hutton, and found it difficult to be approved for re-entry into the United States. May and Mary had jointly petitioned for a receiver to be appointed for Pacific Oil. They wanted money back from the company that had been built with their fortunes, and Mary demanded her husband pay her maintenance. She also claimed Sergei had been violent and controlling towards her. When the brothers returned to America, David declared that they were through with women, while Sergei added, "We are married to our oil company." In fact, the brothers had been fired from their positions in the company on account of the court cases. Sergei went on to accuse Mary of being the one who was violent in their marriage, and she admitted to scratching his face, declaring, "They ought to give me a medal for it." The couple accused each other of adultery, and Sergei went as far as to claim that they weren't actually married, as his divorce from Pola had not been granted at the time of their wedding. This was, of course, false, and when Pola was asked for her opinion, she said Sergei was one of the world's greatest gigolos. When Mary was finally granted a divorce, Sergei promised to pay her back on her investments, and gave her all their joint properties. When Mary discovered that a journalist, Grace Williams, was trying to sell the details of the divorce settlement, Mary went to Grace's office and punched her in the face. Sergei publicly declared his support for the journalist and hired her to write his biography. Grace generated more publicity when she threatened to sue Mary for $1 million in damages. In October 1933, May Murray was granted a divorce, and a couple of months later David and Sergei were indicted for stealing $37,000 from Pacific Oil. In the hope of a favourable ruling, their defence team made sure the jury was mostly female, with 10 women to just 2 men. Meanwhile, Alexis and Barbara Hutton decided to take a second honeymoon to East Asia to escape being involved in the court case. Just as they were about to leave, Alexis was subpoenaed and dashed across America to avoid the summons. When Sergei and David were jailed following their indictment, it was Barbara who paid their $20,000 bail. Alexis and Barbara sailed to Japan on separate boats, and when he arrived first, Alexis was detained by Japanese officials because they considered his Georgian passport invalid. Alexis was freed when the officials learned who his wife was, and of her extravagant spending habits. Barbara did not let Japan down, and once the couple were reunited, they managed to spend $30,000 on jewellery alone in just 2 days. While Barbara enjoyed sightseeing and collecting porcelain, Alexis was bored of the trip from the very start. When the couple moved on to Peking, China, he screamed and threw himself on the floor in a tantrum every time Barbara decided to extend their stay. Despite his irritable behaviour, there might have been an ulterior motive behind Alexis's presence in the East. China especially was home to many émigrés who had fled the Russian Empire after the revolution, and through his work with the Georgian legation, it is possible Alexis became part of plans to raise an army of exiled Georgians and take back the homeland. Although this never came to pass, Sergei and David would be accused of raising a private army with the same goal in America. In fact, Sergei, who was a military enthusiast, had been observed drilling a pretend army on a film set, and the army uniform he was often observed wearing in public was the uniform of a civilian military club of which he was a member. After 2 months in China, Alexis was pleased to move on to India, where he could once again play polo. The couple stayed with various Maharajas, whose displays of wealth even Barbara Hutton thought obscene. Chests of uncut diamonds and heaps of priceless jewels and gold could be found casually piled up in their sprawling palaces, in stark contrast to the extreme poverty only walking distance away. After catching dysentery, Barbara and Alexis returned to London, where they slept in separate bedrooms. When Alexis returned to India, she did not accompany him, and by her 22nd birthday party, a star-studded affair held at the Ritz in Paris, it was clear the marriage had completely broken down. Barbara spent the entire night dancing with Count Hogwitz Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat originally introduced to her by Alexis. Barbara ended the marriage in March of 1935. Alexis, with Rusi's help, desperately tried to salvage things, but to no avail, and the day after Barbara was granted a divorce in Reno, she married Count Reventlow. She would go on to have 7 marriages in total, all of which were disastrous. In late 1934, the charges against David and Sergei were dismissed after a string of court cases where the brothers displayed genuine naivety when it came to business. May Murray had declared bankruptcy, and had to ask a neighbour to lend her rent money for the small apartment where she and her son had been reduced to living. In the hope of earning a living on the stage, she returned to New York with Karan. She received an offer to make films in England, but only days before she was set to sail, Karan fell ill and needed immediate surgery. By the time he had recovered, it was too late for May to go to England. With her debts piling up, including hospital bills amounting to roughly $53,000, May decided to leave Karan in the care of the siblings of Dr. Cunning, who had performed the surgery. May was forced to turn to friends to help pay her bills, as David refused to even pay child support unless he was given full custody of Karan. May made sure David didn't even know where his child was living. When May failed to find work and could not pay her hotel bill, she was forced to leave with only a hat box containing the bare essentials, and slept on a bench in Central Park for 3 nights. When she was able to visit Karan, she explained her situation to the Cunnings, and they said he could stay for as long as necessary, allowing May to return to Hollywood. Towards the end of their marriage, Barbara Hutton had bought Alexis the Abbey of San Gregorio in Venice, a former monastery built some time before the 15th century. After their divorce, Alexis began refurbishing it with the help of Russi and José Sert, who painted the impressive wall murals. Alexis enjoyed many polo victories and by that time owned 30 polo ponies, and was constantly linked to beautiful and famous women in the papers. He had continued his affair with Toto Koopman throughout both of his marriages, and there were rumours he would marry the widowed Maharani of Cooch Behar, Indira Devi. Alexis had actually begun an affair with Baroness Maud von Thyssen in the summer of 1935. The 25-year-old was a former model whose real name was Elsa Zarsk, and at 23 she had married a 57-year-old steel magnate. On August 1st, 1935, after staying at Mashuni, Alexis and Maud were driving at reckless speeds in his Rolls-Royce when he swerved into a tree to avoid roadworks. Not only was the front of the car crushed by the impact, but it proceeded to flip over multiple times. Alexis likely died instantly, while Maud was severely injured. When the crash was found by locals, it was Salvador Dali they called first. He was tasked with breaking the news to Russi, who immediately rushed to the crash and became hysterical with grief. She threw herself on her brother's mangled corpse, while Maud was taken to the hospital, where she remained unconscious for 10 days. Her first questions upon waking were about Alexis, but she was not told of his death for 5 more weeks. Maud was disfigured in the crash and lost sight in one eye. The press tastelessly focused on the scandal of her affair with Alexis, and her husband eventually divorced her. Headlines were full of lurid claims as to what had led the couple to crash. Nina Mdivani believed the Soviets knew about Alexis's work for Georgia's independence and had tampered with the car. She had it sent back to the Rolls-Royce factory in England for investigation. While nothing suspicious was found, the car was fully restored and went on to be sold multiple times. It now resides in Texas. Alexis had planned to buy a piece of land on which stood a small church near Mashuni. He had wanted to marry Maud there once it was restored, and only days before his death he had remarked to José Sert that the cemetery would be a nice place to be buried. Less than a week later, he was buried there. He was only 27. A while later, a woman in black was seen visiting Alexis's grave. People wondered if it was Baroness Maud, while others believed it was Alexis's first wife, Louise Van Allen. In February of 1936, Louise married Sergei Mdivani, and only weeks later, while playing polo in Florida, he fell and received a fatal kick from his horse. Louise rushed onto the field and remained by his side in the pouring rain and lightning, even after doctors told her he was dead. David Gigauri learned of his brother's death over the radio while travelling. The family had not yet finished dealing with Alexis's estate, a fifth of which was willed to Barbara Hutton. Louise ironically was paid back for all her trouble with Barbara, when Louise inherited money from Sergei, which he had inherited from Alexis, which had originally been given to Alexis by Barbara. Most of Alexis's fortune was split between the remaining Mdivanis and given to charity. Alexis had always been active in helping the Georgian community, and his money went on to finance higher education for many émigrés. Having been so close, Russi was utterly devastated by Alexis's death, and turned to morphine, barbiturates, and alcohol to cope. Her condition worsened when Sergei died only 6 months later. She rapidly lost so much weight she became skeletal and looked as though all her former vivacity had drained from her. Despite their friends' concern, Jose refused to believe there was anything wrong with his wife, and furthermore believed all illness was simply weakness. The couple tried to live as they always had, and went sailing with friends in the Mediterranean on a fishing boat they had converted into a yacht and named the St. Alexis. Despite having a constant fever and a serious cough, Russi insisted on swimming for hours each day, and by the time she returned to Paris, she was so exhausted she took to her bed entirely. Russi chain-smoked and often burned the bed sheets by falling asleep with a lit cigarette. Mzia would sit with her for hours each day until she finally went to sleep, and when friends managed to convince Russi to see a doctor, she was found to be in an advanced stage of tuberculosis. Coco Chanel accompanied her to a clinic in Switzerland, but before Russi left, Jose beat her for leaving him, still refusing to believe his wife's illness was real. Mzia went to Lourdes to pray for Russi, and lit a candle so large it took 2 men to carry it. Nevertheless, Russi died with Nina at her bedside on the 10th of December 1938. She was only 33 years old, and her final wish was to be buried beside Alexis. David arrived too late to say goodbye. Russi was buried in the village of St. Sapharin in Switzerland, and in 1951 Nina arranged for Alexis's remains to be moved there, so brother and sister could rest side by side for eternity. While the rest of her siblings' lives dramatically played out across the headlines, Nina Mdivani had led a comparatively quiet, though no less interesting life. Since her marriage to Charles Hubrick, the couple had lived mostly in Berlin or The Hague, where Charles had offices. They regularly travelled the world, socialising with royalty, celebrities and politicians. Charles had acted as lawyer to each of the Mdivani boys and advised Zachary on his numerous business dealings. Nina was also attentive to her father and spent much of her time organising her siblings' lives while longing to start a family of her own. She considered adoption when she could not conceive. Nina became increasingly exhausted with her marriage as her husband faced mounting financial problems. In 1934, she became acquainted with Dennis Conan Doyle, the son of Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle, and the two began writing to each other regularly. Nina and Dennis shared an interest in spiritualism and a passion for expensive cars. Nina bought Dennis and his brother Adrian a racing car each. In the summer of 1936, Nina and Charles Hubrick amicably divorced, and Nina married Dennis at a registry office in Bridgend, Wales that August. Nina was 36 and Dennis was 27, but Nina claimed to be 31 on the marriage register. Word spread quickly that a princess and a Conan Doyle were being married, and by the time the couple emerged from the registry office, such a large crowd of well-wishers had formed, police were needed to part the sea of people. The newlyweds honeymooned at St. Donat's Castle, which had been built sometime in the 12th century and belonged to media tycoon William Randolph Hearst. Nina was good friends with Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, and was allowed to borrow the castle. While Nina was interested in spiritualism and believed she was clairvoyant, Dennis went as far as to consult his dead father through seances and always listened to the ghost's advice. Meanwhile, David briefly dated the sister of Marion Davies, before embarking on a relationship with famous French actress Arletty. They remained lifelong friends, despite rumours she had terminated a pregnancy with David's child, and her later disgrace for having German sympathies during the occupation of France in World War II. David still refused to help his son Karan financially, and according to May Murray, when she begged for support and even offered to tell David Karan's whereabouts, he replied, "I'm not interested in where the boy is, I'll see both of you in the gutter." In Hollywood, May was still blacklisted thanks to her former bosses at MGM, but when she returned to New York, she found moderate success as a radio show hostess, offering advice of the agony aunt type to women. In mid-1939, when she approached the Cunnings to retrieve Karan, they refused to give him back. After David refused to help her, May sued him for $12,000 a year in child support. During the court hearing, she refused to state Karan's exact date of birth, or even where he had been born, and also refused to say her own age. When the questioning became too difficult for her, May sobbed, and it soon became clear David would only support his son if he could have full custody. May went to New York and petitioned the court to force the Cunnings to give Karan to her, while David officially filed for custody. When May tried to see her son, the Cunnings would not allow her to, and on subsequent visits the tension was palpable. May believed the Cunnings were turning her son against her, and eventually the decision of custody came down to Karan, who said he wanted to remain where he was. May was not ready to give up, but decided to return to Hollywood briefly, where she managed to find some work and had a few brief flings and was often spotted at popular clubs. She returned to New York to hear the final decision in the custody battle, and went into hysterics when the judge's decision to give the Cunnings custody was read out to her. May had no stable home or income and would be allowed to seek custody again only when she had those things in order. May threw an inkwell at her lawyer, which missed him and crashed through the office window, falling 20 floors onto the street below. The lawyer forcibly threw May out of his office, and she immediately returned to California, where she was offered a film contract, but ultimately declined because of her worsening health. She sued David for $1,000 a month, so she would have the money to provide a stable home for her son. She sobbed in court as she testified about her marriage and the circumstances that had led her to sleep on a bench in Central Park. David testified that May had made it too difficult for him to see his son, and that she had even been pleased about the death of his brother Alexis. May was ruled a fit mother, and David was ordered to pay her $400 a month. In July 1940, May was telling the court she had a house and providing proof she had stable sources of income, but inexplicably, by August, she abandoned her case entirely and would not see her son again until she was on her deathbed 25 years later. May claimed she gave up because Karan kicked her and ignored her when she visited him, but Karan himself denied this ever happened and said David Gigauri paid the Cunnings to continue fighting May in court and officially adopt Karan. Although David had no interest in being in his son's life, he would not let May have him either, and in 1941 Karan was legally adopted and his name was changed to Daniel Michael Cunning. David joined the US Army in December of 1941 and was honourably discharged in 1943 without having seen action. In September 1944 he married Virginia Sinclair, the adoptive daughter of the founder of Sinclair Oil. A year later the couple welcomed a son, Michael, but among the Mdivani circle there were rumours that Virginia was not actually the child's mother. David had become a US citizen in 1943, after which he went by Mr. instead of Prince Mdivani. With his oil business, as well as the inheritances he had received from his brothers, David lived comfortably and faded from the limelight. In 1957 he and Virginia separated, and in 1959 she filed for divorce, citing cruel and inhuman treatment. She also took out a restraining order against David and filed for custody of their 14-year-old son. In a peculiar turn of events, David sued Virginia's close friend, Virginia Catherwood, for turning his wife against him. He accused Catherwood of luring his wife into a lesbian affair and sued Catherwood for $1 million in compensation. To avoid the scandal reaching the papers, Virginia returned to David and abandoned the divorce. They remained together until 1964, when Virginia divorced David on the same grounds of cruelty. Despite this, they remained living together until Virginia made David leave in 1977. When she died in 1979, David moved back into their home and lived with his son Michael. Towards the end of his life, David became increasingly reclusive and stopped taking care of his health. He died of a heart attack at the age of 80 on the 5th of August 1984. And so Nina, the eldest of the siblings, also became the last of them. Since her marriage to Dennis Conan Doyle, the couple had lived mostly off the royalties from the Sherlock Holmes estate, which Nina helped to manage. Dennis learned through seances that his father's ghost approved of the marriage. However, Dennis's brother Adrian never liked Nina. In 1939, the couple moved to America to oversee a new Sherlock film and adapt one of the books for Broadway. When war broke out, they controversially remained there, even when Dennis received accusations of avoiding joining the army. Nina and Dennis only returned to England in 1943, when they couldn't possibly stay away any longer due to business. They lived in a cottage on the grounds of Windlesham Manor, Arthur Conan Doyle's East Sussex home. The couple always lived beyond their means. Nina adored expensive clothes and jewels, and she and Dennis travelled regularly. They lived in Spain for most of 1944 and 1945, while dealing with Rusi's will. In 1946, Nina contested the will, after José Cert began giving Rusi's possessions to friends instead of the family. Rusi's affairs were complicated, with much of her money and possessions being mysteriously unaccounted for. Despite Nina's marriage to Dennis being an extremely loving one, in 1950 she became besotted with Anthony Harwood, a writer who was about 25 at the time. Nina took him on extravagant shopping sprees and convinced Dennis to employ Anthony as his secretary. He accompanied the couple on their travels to Africa, India, and elsewhere, and Nina spent most of her time with him. By the mid-1950s, Dennis's health was declining, and his brother Adrian discovered that Dennis had kept large sums of the Sherlock Holmes royalties for himself, as well as failing to pay his siblings money that was owed to them. Dennis had significant unpaid hotel bills and was in debt to a film producer who had given him $10,000. When the producer wanted the money back, Dennis had already spent it. Adrian blamed Nina's extravagance. She drove a Rolls-Royce and travelled with 60 pieces of Louis Vuitton luggage, as well as owning one of the finest turquoise collections in the world, but she refused to sell her possessions to pay her debts. In the early 1950s, Nina and Dennis, as well as Anthony, travelled to India, and Anthony fell gravely ill. In the hospital, Nina prayed that if only he recovered, she would do some great act of charity. At the very moment she thought this, she heard the heart-wrenching cry of a child, and when she inquired where the sound came from, she was shown an emaciated orphan lying in a Coca-Cola box. The girl was called Taksin, and Nina paid for her treatment. When Anthony recovered and they left India, Nina took Taksin with her. On another trip to India in 1955, Dennis died of a heart attack and Nina was inconsolable. Anthony comforted her in her grief, and 2 years later they were married in Paris. The couple lived almost entirely at Claridge's and still travelled despite mounting unpaid bills. In 1968, Nina threw Anthony out, possibly after discovering he was actually gay. He had his own flat in Sloane Square in London, where he could focus on his writing, and lived with gay film director Derek Jarman. After Anthony's death in 1976, Derek remained in the flat until he was evicted and decided to destroy the place as revenge on his landlord. He filmed the process of trashing the apartment and turned it into a short film. As well as her sight failing from the 50s onwards, Nina and Adrian Conan Doyle spent much of the early 1960s suing each other. Nina wanted out of the Conan Doyle estate, but could never come to a resolution with the Conan Doyles about it. After Adrian's death in the early 1970s, the rest of the family decided to sell the rights to Sherlock Holmes, and they were bought by Nina through a go-between company. With only a few years until Sherlock Holmes would enter the public domain, Nina set about making as much money as she could from the brand. She created Sherlock-themed whiskey, condiments and biscuits, as well as planning films and having Sherlock adapted for a hit play on the West End. In a few years, Nina was seeing good profits and split her time between New York and London. She still mixed in the same high society circles. Among her friends were Lee Radziwill, the sister of Jacqueline Kennedy, Andy Warhol, and high-profile émigrés such as the nephews of the last Tsar. Nina used bank loans to spend extravagantly, and her bank eventually made it so every expense had to be approved. In old age, Nina was mostly confined to her home, but was regularly visited by her many friends and attended to by staff. She passed away peacefully at the age of 85 on the 19th of February 1987. Barbara Hutton had given her a priceless jade necklace years before, and after her death, it was found under Nina's bed. It fetched a record price of $27.4 million when it was sold at Sotheby's in 2014. Although almost entirely forgotten today, less than 100 years ago the Mdivanis were an inescapable part of the media. They were the first family to be famous for being famous. Jean Cocteau wrote a play about Rusi's relationship with the Certs. F. Scott Fitzgerald mentioned the family in a short story. They were also mentioned in Dale Carnegie's classic self-help book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Alexis and Barbara's marriage was mocked in numerous plays and even a few films, while prolific romance novelist Barbara Cartland dedicated one of her books to Nina. Their whirlwind existences were summed up best by a French writer who knew them. Countless fantastic stories unfolded as a result of the Russian Revolution, but none rivaled the frenzy and theatrics of the Mdivani Saga. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss another one. Until next time.